Rome didn't just conquer cities. It erased bloodlines. One crown at a time. One child at a time. And sometimes, it made the world watch the last heir breathe his final breath, so no one would ever dare to dream of a throne again. This is the hidden price behind Rome's victory. Not paid in gold. Not paid in soldiers. Paid in royal DNA. A story where triumph meant something colder than conquest, the deliberate ending of a family line. His name was Perseus, last king of Macedon. The final heartbeat of a dynasty that traced its legend back to Alexander the Great. Macedon wasn't just another kingdom on Rome's map. It was a memory. A myth with an army. A name that still made men straighten their backs, because not long ago, Macedonian spears had decided the fate of the world. And Perseus inherited that shadow. He ruled a land that remembered glory like an addiction. The old soldiers still spoke of Alexander as if he might return tomorrow. The nobles still carried themselves like their blood was heavier than everyone else's. And Perseus understood something Rome feared: symbols are stronger than swords. Rome, at this point, was no longer a rising power. It was a machine. Disciplined. Patient. Punishing. It didn't just defeat enemies. It rewrote what enemy meant. Kings were no longer rivals to be respected. They were threats to be removed. Perseus wasn't naive. He watched Rome swallow Greece piece by piece, smiling while it tightened the chain. He saw how alliances became traps. How protection became control. How Rome could call a war necessary, and make the Senate sound like a court of gods passing judgment. But Perseus also knew Macedon still had teeth. Money in its vaults. Fortresses in its mountains. Loyal soldiers who had grown up hearing they were heirs to conquerors. History remembers Perseus because he was the last one. The last Macedonian king. The last to wear that crown with any real power behind it. And because when Rome finally moved against him, it didn't just aim for the throne. It aimed for the bloodstream. Rome had learned a brutal truth through centuries of war. If you leave a royal child alive, you don't end a conflict. You delay it. A surviving heir becomes a banner. A rumor. A rallying point strong enough to raise armies from grief and pride alone. So this story isn't only about a battle. It's about a principle. Rome's victory came with a dark price, paid by royal bloodlines that ended in silence. And Perseus, whether he knew it or not, was walking into the kind of war where defeat wasn't the worst outcome. Because Rome could forgive a conquered people. But it rarely forgave a royal name. Perseus didn't take the throne gently. He took it like a man who knew the ground beneath him was cracking. His father, King Philip V, had fought Rome before, and lost. Not a total collapse. Worse. A peace that bled Macedon slowly. Rome didn't need to burn the palace. It could starve it with treaties. It could turn neighbors into informants. It could make Macedon feel watched, even in its own halls. When Perseus rose, he rose into a kingdom under pressure. A kingdom humiliated by paperwork and Rome's smug restraint. And Perseus refused to be Rome's obedient friend. He rebuilt Macedon quietly. Not with reckless declarations. With preparation. He strengthened alliances. He courted Greek cities that feared Rome's growing grip. He stocked treasuries. He drilled troops. He did what Rome hated most. He made independence look possible again. People admired him because he made them remember what pride felt like. Feared him because pride can turn into war. Perseus also understood performance. A king is not only a ruler. He is a story. So he presented himself as disciplined, capable, almost restrained, while sending a message beneath the surface: Macedon is not finished. Rome noticed. Rome always notices. Roman envoys arrived with polished smiles and sharp questions. They listened. They recorded. They left. And after they left, whispers followed. That Perseus was gathering support. That he was flirting with rebellion. That Macedon was no longer under control. In Rome, that phrase, under control, was everything. Because Rome didn't only defend itself. It defended the idea that no one could challenge it. Perseus didn't have to attack Rome for Rome to feel threatened. He only had to exist as a king with a famous lineage and an unbroken crown. Then came the turning of the wind. All it took was one spark, one accusation, one incident, one political maneuver, and suddenly the Senate had what it needed: a reason. Not a true reason. A useful one. War wasn't declared with rage. It was declared with righteousness. Rome painted Perseus as a danger to stability. As a king who couldn't be trusted. As a man who might ignite Greece. And in the Roman imagination, that was unforgivable. Perseus prepared for the storm. He believed Macedon's terrain would protect him. Its fortresses. Its veterans. Its legacy. He believed Rome could be resisted. For a moment, the world held its breath. Because if Perseus succeeded, even partially, it would prove something terrifying. Rome could be stopped. And Rome could not allow that lesson to exist. The war unfolded like a tightening noose. At first, Perseus had hope. He had troops. He had home advantage. He had the faith of people who wanted a story where Rome didn't win. But Rome didn't fight like a hero in a legend. It fought like a system. It sent generals who rotated in and out, each one bringing fresh pressure. It sent diplomats who poisoned alliances with promises. It sent messages to Macedon's neighbors that sounded like peace, and meant surrender. And then came the betrayal that matters most in wars like this. Not a single knife in the dark. A slow abandonment. Allies hesitated. Greek cities that had flirted with Perseus began to back away. Some out of fear. Some out of calculation. Some because Rome offered them survival in exchange for obedience. Perseus discovered the cruel rule of empire. People don't always join the strong. They join the inevitable. Rome made itself inevitable. While Macedon's king tried to rally pride, Rome bought time. And time is a weapon. Then came Pydna. A name that would echo like a funeral bell. Perseus faced the Roman army under Lucius Aemilius Paulus, an enemy with discipline that felt almost unnatural. The Macedonian phalanx, that famous wall of spears, pushed forward like an ancient monster, grinding Rome back. For a moment, it looked like the old world might win. Then the ground betrayed the phalanx. Uneven terrain broke the formation. Gaps opened. And Rome did what Rome did best. It slipped into the cracks. Roman soldiers didn't need to shatter the wall. They needed to get behind it. To turn strength into weakness. The phalanx, unstoppable in perfect order, became vulnerable in chaos. And chaos is Rome's preferred battlefield. Perseus watched the dream collapse in real time. Not dramatically. Not romantically. Practically. Bodies fell. Standards dropped. The sound of victory shifted, like music turning into screaming. And in that moment, Perseus made a choice that history would never forgive. He fled. Maybe to save his life. Maybe to preserve the dynasty. Maybe because kings are human, and humans panic. But symbols don't get to panic. When the king ran, the myth ran with him. And Rome, sensing blood in the water, closed in. Perseus became a moving target, no longer a ruler, but a fugitive. He sought refuge in sanctuaries and strongholds, the old places that promised safety. But Rome had another lesson for the world. Even gods step aside for Rome. One by one, doors closed. One by one, protectors became bystanders. One by one, the king of Macedon learned what it means to be alone while an empire hunts you. He wasn't just being defeated. He was being isolated. Because once the king is isolated, the bloodline is next. Perseus's capture wasn't a heroic last stand. It was worse. It was inevitability arriving. He was cornered, exhausted, stripped of options. A king reduced to bargaining with fate. There are versions of the end, details shifting through ancient accounts, but the shape of it is brutal and clear. Perseus surrendered. Not because he wanted to. Because he had run out of world. And Rome didn't treat surrendered kings like equals. Rome treated them like trophies. They brought Perseus to Italy. Not as a guest. As evidence. Imagine the psychological violence of that journey. The sea between Macedon and Rome, once a highway of trade and war, now a corridor of humiliation. This was not simply transport. It was transformation. Every mile turned a king into a prisoner. And then the city. Rome. A place built to swallow men whole. A place where triumph wasn't just celebration, it was theater. Perseus, the last king of Macedon, was forced into that theater. Displayed to the public as proof that Rome's enemies always end the same way. In a Roman triumph, the victorious general parades spoils, captives, and symbols of conquest through the streets. It's not subtle. It's ritual domination. Perseus was marched as part of that spectacle. Not as a man. As a message. The crowd didn't need to know him personally to understand what they were seeing. A crown brought low. A famous name brought to heel. A dynasty being publicly dismantled. And somewhere near him, close enough to be seen, close enough to be remembered, were his children. That detail is the knife. Because Rome wasn't only humiliating Perseus. It was humiliating the future. A royal family in chains isn't just entertainment. It's strategy. It tells every province, every border king, every ambitious noble. This is what happens when you imagine you can be more than Rome allows. Perseus's identity had been built on lineage. On the idea that Macedon's blood was royal, historic, destined. Rome attacked that identity from the inside out. Not with arguments. With spectacle. After the triumph, Perseus was not executed immediately. He was kept, alive, contained, and irrelevant. A living ghost of a kingdom that no longer existed. And if you think that was mercy, understand the cruelty behind it. A dead king can become a martyr. A dead king can become a legend. A king who lives in captivity becomes a cautionary tale. A warning with a heartbeat. Perseus's life was extended just long enough for the world to absorb the lesson. But Rome's real target wasn't Perseus anymore. Rome had already won that war. The real target was the possibility of Macedon returning through his line. Through a son. Through a grandson. Because kingdoms can be rebuilt. But a bloodline, once ended, doesn't rise again. This is where Rome's victory turns dark in a way most textbooks whisper past. Perseus's fate was captivity and death away from his throne. But his bloodline, his children, especially his sons, were the real problem. Rome understood inheritance. You can dismantle an army. You can break a treasury. You can even divide a kingdom into smaller pieces. But if a royal heir survives, the story survives. And stories raise armies. So Rome made sure the story stopped. Perseus's son, Philip, did not get to grow into a man who could rally the Macedonians. He did not get to become a living flag. Ancient sources record a grim end. The boy was killed in Rome, reportedly at a young age. Not on a battlefield. Not as a warrior. As a preventive measure. A political execution disguised by the cold language of security. No gore. No spectacle of blood. Just the quiet elimination of an heir. That's the kind of brutality empires prefer. It doesn't shock the Senate. It doesn't risk sympathy. It simply removes the future. And think about what that means. Rome didn't just defeat Perseus at Pydna. It defeated the concept of Macedon as a kingdom that could ever return. Perseus could rot in captivity. Macedon could be reorganized. Its nobles could be managed. Its wealth could be extracted. But the royal line had to be ended, because monarchy isn't only about governing. It's about belief. As long as a royal child lives, someone can whisper. The true king is out there. Rome couldn't tolerate that whisper. So it silenced it. This was not an accident. Not a side effect. It was the dark price Rome paid for permanent victory. And it wasn't unique to Macedon. Rome's method echoed across centuries. Turn rival kings into prisoners, turn their heirs into problems, then solve the problem permanently. Sometimes Rome did it with swords. Sometimes with prisons. Sometimes with accidents. Sometimes by making sure the heir simply vanished from the record. What matters is the intent. Perseus's defeat became more than a military win. It became an imperial template. After Macedon fell, Rome didn't just expand its influence in Greece. It announced to every royal house near its borders. Your crown is temporary. Your name is fragile. Your children are not safe. That is the terror beneath Rome's greatness. It wasn't built only on roads and legions. It was built on the calculated ending of other people's futures. And somewhere in the heart of Rome, a child with royal blood died so that an empire could sleep without fear of a resurrection. A dynasty ended not with a battle cry, but with a quiet extinguishing. Rome loved to call it order. It called it peace. Stability. Security. But if you strip away the marble language, what's left is something colder. Rome didn't just conquer territories. It conquered time. It reached into tomorrow and decided who was allowed to exist in it. Perseus was a king, yes. But he was also a symbol of something Rome could not control, legacy. And that is why his story matters. Not because he was perfect. Not because he was a flawless hero. History doesn't work like that. He fled. He lost. He was paraded. But the real tragedy isn't his personal failure. It's what his failure allowed Rome to justify. Because once an empire convinces itself that children are threats, there is no bottom. There is no line it cannot cross while still calling itself righteous. Rome didn't need to massacre entire populations every time. It didn't need constant bloodshed in the streets. It only needed to be precise. Remove the king. Remove the heir. Remove the future. Then rebuild the province under Roman terms. It's clean. Efficient. Terrifying. And it works. That's why so many later powers studied Rome like scripture. Not just for its legions and tactics, but for its understanding of psychology. People can survive losing a battle. They can survive paying tribute. They can survive occupation. What they struggle to survive is hopelessness. Rome manufactured hopelessness by making royal bloodlines disappear. Because a people without a legitimate heir, without a living symbol, fractures. They argue. They submit. They adapt. And Rome, always practical, preferred enemies who adapted. So the dark price wasn't only paid by Perseus and his son. It was paid by the idea that history has mercy. Because here's the truth that lingers after the triumph ends and the streets are swept clean. The empire that can decide which family line gets to continue is an empire that has moved beyond war. It has entered something more permanent. Something almost surgical. You can admire Rome's architecture, its law, its engineering. And you can still admit this. Rome's greatness had teeth. And those teeth didn't only bite soldiers. They bit royal children. They bit dynasties. They bit the future. Perseus's fall tells us what happens when power stops being satisfied with victory and starts demanding extinction. So when you hear the word triumph, remember what it often required. A defeated king in chains. A crowd cheering. A general crowned in glory. And somewhere, out of sight or barely recorded, an heir who never got to grow up. Rome called that peace. But if peace is built on the deliberate erasure of bloodlines, what is it really? And here's the question that should haunt you long after this video ends. When an empire wins, how often does it celebrate? While quietly killing the future.